thank you again for your participation in the conference. I encourage you to fill out the feedback form. We're always looking for feedback. You can find that in your registration materials, and if it's somehow gotten lost, there's more at the registration desk. Very important for us. We look at them very carefully. The board will be debriefing, the staff will be debriefing after this conference. I'd very much like to thank again our institutional hosts and our sponsor for this plenary. And I believe, yes, they are now up on the slide so you can see who's helped us make this event possible. And of course, we have our wonderful plenary speakers here, but it's not my privilege to introduce them, though I very much thank them for their participation. I'm going to invite Mary Kay Gugerty to come on up and have that honor. So Mary Kay.
Good morning and welcome back again to our second plenary of our conference. We're really excited about today's plenary, so we thank you for joining us. Before we start on the plenary, I just also wanted to make a reminder about next year's conference in San Diego. So there's the information up on the screen. It'll be about nonprofits and philanthropy in a polarized world. And Brenda will talk more about that conference theme. But I think this is going to be a really interesting kickoff to that theme for next year as we talk about some of the issues that are facing our country and really facing the world today. So we look forward to seeing you next year in San Diego as well. Yesterday in our plenary, we talked about responses to environmental disasters, and today we're sort of shifting our theme and talking a little bit about responses to disasters that are in some ways of our own making, so policy and man-made crises. Our theme for today is Nonprofits on the Line, Organizational and Frontline Challenges and Responses to Border Crises. And we have four amazing organizations here that are themselves on the front lines to responses to issues that are going on the border today. Border issues are happening around the world. It's not just here in the United States, which many of us know. There are ongoing immigration crises in Syria, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But today we're going to kind of take it a little bit closer to home and closer to where we're sitting today and talk about some of the border issues that are going on in Texas. We have four organizations, two national and two Texas-based. And so I'm going to take a few moments just to introduce our four speakers and their organizations, and then I'm going to turn it over to Brenda Bushhouse, my co-chair, who will be moderating for the rest of the morning. I wanted to let you know if there are any members who would need some extra assistance by having printed copies of the slides. One of our panelists will have a short slide presentation, so there's some slides over there by the door. One of our fantastic volunteers has those, so if you need those as an assist, please feel free to go and grab a copy or let her know, and she can bring them to you. So our panelists consist, first of all, of Crystal Massey, who is the volunteer coordinator for the Justice Campaign for the American Immigration Council. The American Immigration Council was established in 1987. It's got a little over $8 million budget with 34 staff, and they focus on using the courts to hold government accountable for upholding immigration laws and their implementation. And Crystal coordinates the Immigration Justice Campaign, which recruits volunteers to provide pro bono assistance. In January, they had about 2,000 volunteers. As of now, they've got about 8,000 volunteers. So they've had an amazing response to the need for volunteers to support. And so she'll talk about that response and about what that's meant for their organization. Next, we have Michelle Mendez, who's a managing attorney for the Defending Vulnerable Populations Project, the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, or CLINIC, which was established in 1988 by the U.S. Conference of Bishops to support networks of community-based immigration programs to assist people to obtain permanent resident status. They have about 65 staff and a $13 million budget with over 330 programs in 47 states and D.C. And they employ over 2,000 lay advocates and attorneys who represent low-income immigrants without regard to race, religion, gender, or ethnic group. And she'll talk about how her organization works to provide training, litigation, and support to increase the number of these lay advocates and attorneys and how they are responding to the crisis. Andrea Meza is the Associate Director for Family Detention for Crises, the Refugee and Immigrant Center for Education and Legal Services here in Texas. They have about over 130 staff, and she said they are hiring daily. Every day they have more staff. So you may have heard of Crises in the news when they had to contend with a very large response inflow of donations through the Wilner's Facebook campaign for assisting family reunification organizations. So they are the largest immigrant nonprofit in Texas. They provide free and low-cost legal services throughout Texas. And Andrea manages the family detention program, and she'll talk about how they work to support staff and volunteers to provide pro bono legal services to families detained at the Carnes Family Detention Center here in Texas. And finally, our very local representative, who we're excited to have with us, is Jennifer Long, who is the executive director of Casa Marianela here in Austin, Texas, which was established in 1986 in response to refugees coming in from Central America. It is the only homeless shelter in Austin and one of the very few in the country that is dedicated solely to serving immigrants. 90% of those they serve are asylum seekers. They serve 120 individuals or families a night and resettle 350 families per year. So they are truly on the front lines of responding to the current issues at the border. So thank you, all of you, for being here today. Michelle, in particular, had to come in from El Paso through Arizona and got in at about 2 a.m. last night. So these guys have worked really hard in the face of a lot of work that they're doing anyway to be here. So we're really grateful that you could join us. And I'm going to turn the floor over to Brenda to launch the panel. Thank you.
Well, first I want to welcome and thank you for sharing the work of your organizations at ARNOVA with us today. Today we're going to focus on families seeking asylum. Immigrating to the U.S. is a very complex process, and the policies and procedures immigrants experience when they reach the border have changed substantially over and over again. Crystal Massey and Michelle Mendez, who both work to assist detained women and children at the 2,400-bed South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas, they're going to begin the plenary. Actually, it's going to be Crystal, begin the plenary by explaining how government treatment of families at the border has changed. So please.
Thank you. And I was just asked if somebody could put the slides, whoever has that. Thank you. As you can see here, there are a wide variety of organizations, in addition to the organizations that are represented here today, who have worked specifically with family detention and worked on ways to make a viable volunteer program to help meet the legal needs of women and children who are detained just about 2 hours south of here. We have to teach our volunteers how to represent asylum seekers at credible fear interviews at the Dilley Pro Bono Project. So we have a very specific niche in the asylum process where we need our volunteers to come in and help. I want to show you just a little bit about the ports of entry. So this shows some pictures from several bridges going from Juarez in Ciudad Juarez, which is in Chihuahua, Mexico, right across the border from El Paso, Texas. And you have a mother with 2 of her children who, when you hear people talk about presenting at a port of entry, they're talking about walking to a place where you go and present your papers to an official, a place where there are U.S. officials. It can be an airport, it can be a bridge from one town to another, it can be just a walkway or a road, but a place where there are officials, where people know there are going to be officials, and where people go and ask for asylum, they ask for help. Many people have never heard the word asylum, but they will come to the border and they will ask an official to help. They'll tell them, I will be killed in my country if you send me back. I'm in danger. Please don't send me back. And that's expressing fear, and that is something that is supposed to be recognized as asking for asylum. Border Patrol officers don't always recognize that as such, but they are supposed to, because it's not, we don't believe it's reasonable to ask people to learn about asylum on their way here as they are fleeing. We have seen quite a few changes at ports of entry. And last week, the administration declared some changes to the way that they're going to treat people who present between ports of entry. And so right now they're saying that if somebody doesn't go to a port of entry and ask an official right there, if they cross a river at the closest place they arrive to the United States, if they go over a wall, if they walk through a desert, that in those cases, they said they're no longer going to allow them to ask for asylum. And immediately the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center filed lawsuits against the administration for this, but it's an ongoing battle. And I wanted to show you, right now it is legal for somebody to ask for asylum, even if they don't go to a port of entry. There's a woman there in the bottom in the middle, and she's also in the bottom on the left. That's actually a picture of her in southern Mexico, seeing a map at a shelter there. And she chose the closest place she could go to because she was 8 months pregnant. She was fleeing a horrific situation. She got to the border, she crossed the first river she could get to, and immediately asked the very first officer she ran into for help and asked for asylum. And all of that was legal. Both of the women who are pictured here are people who currently have asylum. It took years for them to get through this process, but they have obtained asylum. The bridges look very different this week, and this picture is just from 2 weeks ago, than it did a few years ago. Right now, we have families camped out on the bridges, many of whom have been there 2 to 3 weeks. Right now, a new thing that's been happening just as of a few days ago is that the US government is working with the Mexican government, including with people coming from Mexico asking for asylum, and saying, no, you have to wait in northern Mexico with no shelters, nothing in place to help them. And they're writing numbers on their arms, telling them this is your, with a Sharpie, they're saying this is your number and we will call you when it's time for you to be processed. And the numbers are already up into the 400s in El Paso. At that port of entry, but they're still stuck in Juarez, waiting a turn, and those numbers are growing daily. We have families sitting on the bridge, and our response is not corresponding to the reality of the needs. If you look at the bridge there, we are more and more often having police and riot gear come out with families sitting holding children on the bridge who are the people who are actually asking for help. I wanted you to see this because this is tied to a 2014 crisis of people fleeing violence in their countries of origin, mostly Central America, who are arriving at our border. And that is when family detention grew exponentially. And that is when our organization started working together in a very coordinated way. And what we were discovering is that if women and children were arriving and just talking with asylum officers about their fear and that they would be killed when they went back to their country of origin, they were often talking in very general terms. And when we could get attorneys in to speak with them, when we could get people who had been trained on how this process works and what a credible fear interview is for, and when people could understand, oh, I'm supposed to talk about my personal story, they need to know why I personally had to flee this situation, it turned everything around. And last year, in the year of 2019, people at the Dili Pro Bono Project, there were over 12,000 women who came through there last year, and their children, and 99% of them received positive, credible fear interviews and were processed out to live with family members or to go to shelters. I wanted to talk to you about the volunteer aspect. Asylum is incredibly complicated. It's difficult to explain to attorneys who do not focus on immigration anything about asylum. It's difficult to explain even to immigration attorneys how the asylum part of the process works. It is an incredibly complicated, convoluted system. And we have the job with our volunteers and with programs that are run on volunteer energy of trying to explain to a volunteer the asylum process from positive, credible fear interview, which is what we help people with in Dili, all the way through to a possible appeals. And if they're released from detention, that can take years. We have to talk with them about expedited removal and what that means. We have flow charts that we use as we're talking to attorneys about what this looks like, or law students who are coming to volunteer. We have to talk about the CFI, the credible fear interview purpose and significance, and help them understand this. One thing that is always shocking to our volunteers is that the asylum officers who are doing these interviews and making these decisions, many of them are not attorneys. There's no requirement to be an attorney. Oftentimes people think that judges are making these decisions. They're not. It might be somebody who just had 2 months of some type of training and was tossed in. Oftentimes the interpretation access is non-existent for rare languages and leads to many issues of itself. We have to be able to talk with our volunteers, people who are coming to spend 1 week with us in Dilley, about what's going to happen during a credible fear interview, because it's their job as a volunteer over the course of a week to prepare woman after woman after woman for the interview that is going to determine whether she is deported back to her death or possibly to the death of one of her children, or whether or not they will be processed in and allowed to go through the asylum process in the United States. So it's an incredible level of pressure on our volunteers. We have to be able to explain to our volunteers that the asylum officers actually have boxes they have to check off, and we have to be able to educate them so that they understand. It doesn't matter if you can prove that you will be killed when you're sent back. You have to be able to prove it's for a specific reason. And we have to help attorneys be good listeners and law students be good listeners, and then help them help a client tell their story. So as we were responding to this particular crisis, going back to 2014, in Artesia, New Mexico, when they started sending a large number of women and children there, and then in 2015, they moved the detention center to Dilley, where they have 2,400 beds for women and children and usually keep it close to capacity. We have constantly been struggling with how do we prepare our volunteers for this? How do we maintain the number of volunteers we need? We have consistently struggled from 2015 through the end of 2017 with how on earth are we going to have enough volunteers on the ground to help with the number of intakes and preparations we need to do with women this week. And then with family separation, the numbers of people interested in volunteering has skyrocketed. And so now one of our questions is, how do we maintain that interest? How do we continue to educate the people who have signed up? How do we take advantage of some of the people who have signed up who might not speak Spanish or might not be attorneys? And how do we use that energy? And so as we are looking ahead at some of the, as we're still dealing with the issues around family separation, we are also looking at what the residual effects, the things that we're still dealing with. Today, we are hoping to have over 20 mothers and children who had been separated at the border and then reunited to be locked up down in Dilley, where they have been for 4 months. We are hoping that some of them are going to get out today. We don't know for certain. All of this is on ice. But there are still families that have been separated that we have in jail. There are still families that are separated and parents have been deported. And all of our organizations are trying to find ways to work together to continue to fight, as every week it seems we have new policy to deal with as well.
Thank you, Crystal, for that background information so that we can understand what's happening on the ground. So now we're going to shift to what's happening in Austin. So I'm going to turn to Jennifer Long to tell us about Casa Marianella and the demands that you have for services and how you're trying to meet those.
Right. So Casa Marianella, as was mentioned, started in the 1980s. And at that time, there were a lot of people coming from Central America, from El Salvador and Guatemala. And there was a large social movement opposing military aid to those countries. And so there was a lot of interest. And there were at that time a whole network of shelters around the country that were helping people. But unfortunately, they closed when those wars ended. And then the next group came and the next group came. Luckily, Casa Marianella stayed open. And we are able to serve 120 people a night with shelter. We also provide legal services and English classes and case management in 9 houses that we own here in Austin. Most of the people are coming to us now from detention centers, and that's, of course, been a big change in the 20 years that I've been at CASA, because it used to be that people came straight from the border, but now everyone's being put in detention. We get letters, 50 letters a week probably, from detention centers all over the country, people looking for shelter. Because there's a handful of shelters, I only know of one other shelter that writes letters to people in detention inviting them. We can't write nearly as many letters as we need to. We also get referrals from attorneys for kids who have been in detention as juveniles and they're aging out on their 18th birthday, and if they don't have somewhere to go, they go into adult detention. And we work with Crises and the other partners to try to find shelter. One of the difficulties of our work is that asylum seekers are not allowed to work while they're in proceedings, and they're also not allowed to get public benefits. So I actually don't know. I mean, it's a crazy system that we have. It makes it almost impossible for people to survive. What I've been thinking about, I mean, we need to expand so much, and we need to be preparing for the future. We know there's going to be a lot of displacement with climate change. This question of people coming to our border is not going to change. It's going to increase. And I was thinking, you know, we should look to refugee resettlement agencies because they have a national network, which is brilliant. Unfortunately, a lot of that network is closing down right now because of cuts in funding since we've dropped the number of refugees we're receiving. And I was recently at a refugee conference talking to people about, well, let's shift over to helping asylum seekers, but they don't come with any funding. Refugees come with funding from ORR, and asylum seekers, you have to fundraise to actually serve them. Our most recent crisis that we're dealing with right now is, along with everything that's going on with family detention, there are families that are showing up on the border that Border Patrol is inclined to release. And specifically, a few months ago, I started getting calls from Border Patrol, which was unheard of in the history of our work, saying, well, we have these families here. If you could find a place for them, we won't detain them. And specifically, these are families from Congo and Uganda and Angola, and they're saying, if you find shelter for them, we won't detain them. Well, there was no network to distribute these families into. We found some convents in Kentucky and Kansas and Chicago and a few other organizations around the country, but we're desperately looking for more partners. And this week alone, then Border Patrol just started releasing these families with nowhere to go in particular. And this week alone, we've had 7 families show up on our doorstep since Sunday. One family as large as 7 people, and just reaching out to everyone we can around the country to try to find partners who can help us provide shelter. So that's our current situation here in Austin, Texas.
In Austin. So now let's move to Texas with Crises, who had a very different challenge. They had a Facebook fund that the Wilners set up where they had a budget of $7 million, and then miraculously there was $21+ million in donations. So that's a different kind of a problem. So Andrea, could you talk to us about how your organization handled this?
Sure. I'll talk a little bit about our role with the Family Detention Services. That's where I started working with Crises. When family detention started again in 2014, mothers and children were detained in what was formerly a all-male detention facility for men who had criminal issues, and that's about an hour the other direction opposite Dilley. And so while the Dilley project was starting up too, we were working with these folks to provide similar services in a similar project at the Carnes facility. There were some different challenges, mostly because of the space. Access to counsel was very different because it was previously more of an incarceration facility. We started with a lot of volunteer attorneys who were taking individual cases, and we mentioned the need to adapt your services very quickly based on shifting policy changes. So our project has shifted quite a bit with the different type of work that needs to be done. So with the Carnes facility and family detention, we were able to build up this pro bono project, build up this capacity, and then when we got all of this funding, we suddenly had the ability to hire more attorneys, and it's sort of, at least for the family detention program, put us now in a situation where we have expanded our staff exponentially. We went from when I started in 2015 with the project having a staff of about 2 full-time attorneys, myself and 1 other, and 3 legal assistants, to now having about 30 people on staff this year. And so we're trying for the coming year to sort of rethink what the project looks like, what the need for volunteers is, how we use volunteers. There's always been an advocacy component to having
lay people, regular people, Americans come down and be at these facilities and see firsthand what's happening and talk to these families. But at the same time, with the changing landscape and the policies, it becomes more and more difficult to adequately prepare, as Crystal was saying, volunteers to come in and effectively do this work. So we're thinking about what that's going to look like for the coming year with a bigger staff, but still wanting to integrate the American public into this work. Organizationally, the neat things we've been able to do, like I said, is hire up staff in all of our programs. We also were dealing this past summer with the family separation policies and hearing from parents who were no longer, instead of being sent to these family detention centers, they were ripped from their children. The parents were criminally prosecuted for federal crimes, illegal entry into the United States. They were put into adult detention facilities and their children in ORR custody. And at Raíces, we have a children's program that helps children in ORR custody, and we had some detention capacity to help adults who were in detention centers. So when this happened, we immediately saw a need between these programs that we had to try to connect that and help families get reunified. So with this funding, we have been able to hire more attorneys, and we have set up programs to reunify and connect families who we were helping with both of those programs. And it was definitely a challenge to bridge kind of what had been a gap, the work between the children's program and our program that served adults in detention hadn't historically had a need to be so connected. So one big challenge that arises is how do we keep all of our programs in communication, know who the cases are, identify where the parents are and where the children are. Another thing that we've been doing, because it is difficult when you're hiring a lot of new folks to do really challenging work, to get experienced attorneys to join your organization and do these things, we're looking into partnering with a national organization called KIND that has a lot of pro bono training capacity to expand our pro bono mentorship services so that we can reach out to attorneys who do have experiences with these very challenging cases, as Crystal was talking about, and assist them in taking more of these cases, train capable attorneys to take cases who may not have asylum experience, and we're thinking about using some of those funds to give perhaps small firm attorneys, solo practitioners, stipends and funding so that while they may have the desire and the experience to take on these cases, they may not have the resources and capacity currently to be able to meet that need. There's a very high need out there for competent representation for these very difficult cases. And the third thing that I'll mention that we're doing with the funds is paying bonds to help get people out of detention. So bonds, not everyone is immediately released from detention, as has traditionally, at least for the past few years, been the process with family detention. So a lot of folks have to pay extremely high bonds. When ICE doesn't want to let them out, they go before a judge who can redetermine that custody decision and set a bond. One example is of the enormously high bonds that can be possible is that we have paid a bond that was $80,000 for an individual to be released from detention. So that's sort of a overview of the things we've been able to do, the ways we're expanding, and the ways we're trying to meet the need, the changing need and the challenge.
Yeah, thank you, Andrea. It's an amazing situation that not many will experience, to have that drop of funding in that way. In some ways a wonderful problem to have, but also a very challenging one. So let's move to the national level and talk about Michelle's work with Clinic and the work that you do and how you organize to meet the needs of a family seeking asylum.
Yeah, definitely. So Clinic, as was mentioned in the introduction, we have a network of over 330 nonprofits all over the country, including Puerto Rico. So we provide training, litigation support to those nonprofits all over the country. And that is actually part of the theme of resilience, right? Our theme, because these nonprofits are really in the trenches doing the hard work day in and day out. And through our training, litigation support, we're hoping that we're giving them the resilience to keep going during these times that are so tough, right? And so back during family detention, we decided that we needed to be part of the solution to this problem at the time under President Obama. So we partnered with Raíces, AILA, which is American Immigration Lawyers Association, and AIC, which Crystal represents, American Immigration Council. And together we formed an organization named CARA. The C stands obviously for clinic, A for ALA, et cetera. So the acronym stands for all the organizations. So we partnered to pull together our resources and provide a volunteer experience, bring the volunteers really to fill in the gap to provide orientation to the moms who are detained in Dili as to how to get through the process, the credible fear process, the reasonable fear process, letting them know about what's to come later on. And so we partnered, collaborated, that went really well, and then I ended up shifting over to what was another urgent need that was developing, because the moms, as they were getting released, they were going into the interior of the United States, sometimes to really hostile immigration courts. Immigration courts here in the United States, very different outcomes depending on where you are. New York, San Francisco tends to have higher asylum grants. Places like Charlotte, North Carolina, and Atlanta, Georgia, very low asylum grants. And we were also seeing that the moms who were released were getting these things called in absentia removal orders, basically orders of deportation that the immigration judge would give them when they failed to show up to court. So at that point, we ended up partnering with an organization called ASAP, Asylum Seeker Advocacy Project. New organization, really innovative. And so together we started doing a couple of things. We started a Facebook group where we were putting all the moms that were released from Dili mostly into this Facebook group, and now we have approximately 3,000 women in a Facebook group that's private, that's closed, and through that Facebook group we give orientation in Spanish, videos on how to show up to court, where court is, how to find out what your next hearing is. And so it's very private. Like I said, it's a closed group. It's actually kind of a roundabout way to get there, because for their privacy and their confidentiality, no men are allowed, so we have these very strict rules. And we've been able to prevent in absentia removal orders as a result, because what we learned is that a lot of these moms failed to appear to their hearing, not because they didn't want to. They really could not navigate pro se or on their own this very complex system that is immigration law in the United States. So through that Facebook group, we also learned of the moms that did have the in absentia removal orders, so we ended up representing them on these things called motions to rescind and reopen to the judge. And most attorneys don't want to do those, because once you put in your appearance to those motions, you're kind of on the hook going forward. But we said, these moms need this, and you know what, if we don't do this, the figures of in absentia orders are going to be really high, and then the administration, whichever administration it is, and lo and behold, the Trump administration is doing this, taking those figures and saying that that's why we need more detention for people, because they're not showing up to court. We did a report on this with ASAP as to our findings and as to all of the women who we represented successfully. We represented 96% successfully on motions to the judge and on appeals, because we vow to appeal it all the way up to the federal courts of appeal with great success, and then we placed them pro bono. So, and then now with family separation, what we are facing and what we're continuing to do, we continue to collaborate with ASAP. We have been given 108 cases by USCCB, which is U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. They and LIRS, which is Lutheran Immigration Refugee Services, and Annunciation House, a really interesting shelter, too much like Casa Maria Elena, but in El Paso. And they received most of the families who were coming in and were actually getting reunited and released by the government after they were sued. And so all the families were given to these three organizations primarily, and so USCCB gave us 108 cases. We are working to place those cases with competent counsel. We are keeping the cases afloat in the meantime, meaning that we're doing changes of venue from the El Paso Immigration Court to where they are currently. That's not being done by the government. That's on the families to do, which is creating another crisis of more in absentia removal orders. So we're filing those for them pro se. We are doing the changes of venue. We are keeping in touch with them. We're calling every single family. We're trying to place them. We hired out of our reserves an attorney with a lot of experience to provide mentorship on all the cases that we end up placing. And we're basically trying to do everything that we can for those 108 cases and work collaboratively with other organizations who are helping this family separation crisis, so that we can really ensure that it doesn't just stop at getting them out of detention or getting them reunited and released, but also really that they have a fighting chance no matter where they go in the interior of the United States.
Thank you. I think it's just amazing what we've heard, and what we study in ARNOVA is the organization of volunteers, the collaboration across organizations. We're seeing some amazing work being done here. My question now for you is, what are the gaps? And Michelle, I think I'd like to continue with your discussion, because you're doing tremendous work, but yet what are the gaps that still need to be filled?
Sure. Yes. So you might hear the term, immigration lawyer, but immigration lawyer actually could mean a lot of things. It mostly, honestly, means that a lot of these attorneys do maybe employment-based visas, or they might do family-based petitions to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. But really, a small segment of immigration attorneys do humanitarian removal defense work. So we do have a gap in attorneys who are willing to go to immigration court, which is not in Article 3 of the Constitution. Article 3 of the Constitution of the United States is a judiciary branch. So there are not the same type of safeguards and processes there in immigration court, because it's under the executive branch. So with this in mind, a lot of attorneys are not really interested in doing litigation or removal or defense, or there are some things that happen that they might not be comfortable with due process-wise. And so we have this gap of representation. We have been trying through partnerships with organizations such as NIDA, National Institute of Trial Advocacy, and our own training for lay advocates on court skills trainings and litigation training. So we're trying to fill that gap by getting attorneys and lay advocates who are accredited by the Department of Justice to a place where they feel comfortable to go into immigration court to litigate these cases. So that's one gap that continues, and we're still trying to fill that in that way in those partnerships. But we also have legal representation funding gaps, if you will, because we have, like I said, over 330 nonprofits across the country, but a lot of them are responding to their own individual issues locally. So we have an organization that's very, very good in Ohio, and we've asked them to take a case pro bono for family separation. They can't, because they had to contend with a raid that really decimated a lot of their population, and they had to give a lot of their pro bono and low bono resources to helping those families who were affected by this employment-based raid by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So they couldn't take the case pro bono. So we really need a legal fund, or a fund that will pay for those fees for those attorneys who are willing to take the case, but for this really small issue, which is their fee, and it tends to be about $3,000 or so for their fee to keep afloat their organization. Transportation funding for the families. Sometimes we have found legal assistance for these families, 108 families that we're assisting, but the family can't get to that legal representative. They have no reliable transportation, so they can't afford the transportation, so that's a big one. And a huge place of need, and I put this out there for any of you who want to try to assist in any way. We have a huge need in Florida. A lot of the families are moving to northern Florida, and in northern Florida, there is just a dearth of legal representation for removal defense or deportation defense at the immigration court, which is the Orlando Immigration Court. So we are really trying to tackle that particular state, because that's where a lot of the families, incidentally, are moving to.
Krista, would you like to add to that, given the AIC and the national level work that you do?
So again, I think it's just a big part of our problem is with overwhelming numbers. And so I work with a subset within the American Immigration Council that's called the Immigration Justice Campaign. And we specifically work with attorneys around the country to try to scale up the amount of representation possible for people who are in detention. And while we work with Dilley still, and that's one of the projects that we work with, we also work in adult detention centers in Aurora, Colorado, in Tacoma, Washington, 2 in New Jersey, 1 in Ohio in Youngstown, 3 in Georgia, and 2 in Louisiana. And so in all of those detention centers, the amount of representation for all of the immigrants who are there trying to find someone who can represent them is single digit. Most people are unaware that while your tax dollars go, if you're in the US, your tax dollars are going to pay for a trial attorney from ICE to be there to try to deport someone and to fight against them in the immigration system. We do not have anything to help provide a defense attorney to people in the immigration system, not in the asylum system either. And so people are on their own unless they have money. And they often put the detention centers in very isolated areas. Dilley, there's no public transportation to get from here to there. There's no public transportation from San Antonio to there. So it's very difficult oftentimes for attorneys to even find the time to go, in addition to the complications of the system and developing better educational platforms. We have many more attorneys than ever before interested in helping, but we have to find ways to be able to mentor them so that the assistance they're giving to the clients is adequate and vigorous and that people are going to win their cases. And so that is another big hole that we're looking at, is how to educate the attorneys that are there, how to possibly change policy so that we can have the government making certain that if they're going to detain people, that there are defense attorneys there for them as well.
And I'm just going to take a break right now because I was supposed to wear Mary Kay's watch. So how much time do we have? It's 9:30. Good. Thank you. Give me a finger when it's 9:50 because we want to have time for questions for the last 10 minutes of the plenary. So we're doing well. So what gaps do you see, Andrea?
I don't think you can underscore enough the gap that is the need for representation for folks and for training for attorneys who are interested in this. But something that I want to talk about is the need for social services for our clients and even for the attorneys and other advocates who are working on the front lines. When you're talking about asylum cases, you're talking about people who have fled really terrible conditions and who then have to go into a hostile court system and talk about these things. You're talking about folks who are dealing with trauma and the effects of trauma, who are being told that they have to remember things in a chronological order, that they have to be consistent when they're telling their stories, that they have to tell stories of sexual violence, of physical violence with enormous detail to sound credible, and that in all of this, there's going to be an attorney paid for with our taxpayer dollars, trying to undercut holes in their stories, and a judge who also works for the government who's probably not going to be very receptive to their claim. And so within all of this, attorneys in immigration practice and in asylum practice do have a history of working with social workers, psychiatrists, mental health care providers to get often an expert affidavit to bolster their client's credibility in court and to talk about the emotional and psychological harms and to sort of quantify that for the immigration judge. But that's not enough. I think that folks, attorneys, need to and often want to work better with social service providers to make sure that our clients' needs are being met. I think Jennifer can probably talk a lot about how, unlike refugees who are processed outside of the country and come in with benefits, with funding, with access to services, these asylum seekers who come to our borders don't have access to any of that. And so it's hard to try to coordinate transportation, to get them to appointments, to have them tell their stories when there's not support besides an attorney who is probably untrained in a lot of these things, trying to help them communicate their story, put it into writing, and prepare them for testimony in court, while they're also dealing with getting their children enrolled in school, adjusting to life in a new country, dealing with the fact that they probably don't have work authorization for many months after getting here, et cetera.
Thank you. Let's shift to the Austin level with the amazing work that Casa Marianella does and the challenges in terms of where are these Casa Marianellas around the rest of the country?
Right. You know, the United States is in violation of UN conventions that we are a part of in how we treat people who come to our border. Because when people come to the border, we put them first in these freezing cold cells to be processed, and then we send them to prison-like facilities. And there are different models of how to do this in Europe and Canada, where you give people decent housing and legal representation and medical services, and you wait to see how they come out. You don't treat them like they're a terrorist before you have even identified them. But we have a desperate need for housing, and my personal goal is to try to develop a national network of housing because it does not exist. And I feel like It's a tragedy that we have an ever-growing network of detention centers, but we need to develop an ever-growing network of alternatives in order to undercut the need for detention centers. We need to have something that we can offer in its place. Currently, you know, I've used up the few little resources I have in other parts of the country where I can send people to, and I know that there's people out there that will do it, but the work really needs to be done to create that alternative.
So there's tremendous strain in terms of dealing with a demand for services. And so one of the questions that we talked about earlier was, can the nonprofit sector respond? Is it possible within the sector to meet the needs? And so I open this up for discussion, and then after that we'll be shifting to questions from the audience. There's a microphone at the back of the room, and we'll go into question and answer. But my question for you is really the response of the sector to the demand and your thoughts. And I'll leave this open for who would like to start.
I guess I'll start because we're all looking at one another like who shall go. So I do think the nonprofit sector can respond. I think a couple of things must happen though. I think we have to be willing to collaborate and be very transparent with one another because there are finite resources out there, and the reality is, as I'm sure all of you know, is that these finite resources are available usually through grants and things that we have to compete for. And so I think a lot of that is in the background in immigration, in other nonprofit fields where we feel like we can't really collaborate or be as transparent because we have this small pot of money usually, sometimes bigger, but pot of money that we're all competing for. And if we do collaborate or are transparent, then we might lose our opportunity. So I think we've got to put that aside. And then if we can put that aside and really collaborate, we will make our resources really go a lot further. We will be a lot more creative in problem solving than we would be on our own. And because all of you know better than anyone else in this world probably, given your fields, that two people are better than one, two brains are better than one, more brains are better than one, right? And so if we can do that in the nonprofit immigration sector, I think we can do so much more, but there are a lot of those impediments still present.
I would flag two other things that I think we have to do a better job of dealing with to maintain some of the solutions we found. We have incredible numbers of volunteers willing to work with asylum seekers, and as Andrea mentioned, it's brutal work. Secondary trauma is a real thing, and we see its impacts on a daily basis. We also have incredible needs for people who speak rare languages. Just in Dilley in 2017, we had people who came in who spoke over 45 different languages. And many of those languages are, you can call Language Line, you can look as best you can. You're not going to find anyone to help you with some of those languages unless you have a connection somewhere. And there are incredible people who are out there helping us interpret Hausa or Triqui or Mam or Quechua, and we are calling on them over and over and over again. And if we don't come up with a way to remunerate them on occasion, if it's always asking for volunteer hours, if we don't find a way to find a broader base of people to reach out to, and we're asking the same person over and over again to listen to horrific stories that keep them up for weeks, I don't think it's sustainable unless we can develop a broader base for languages, come up with ways to pay some of the people who help us with rare language issues, and also to deal better with the people we are always going to who need to be able to step back occasionally to deal with some of the emotional issues that go along with asylum work.
I'll raise two things. I think that we can respond if we are able to join also with the private sector. I mentioned one of the components of our pro bono initiative is reaching out to attorneys in private practice who do have this experience, but maybe, like Michelle mentioned, just don't have the funds or the resources within their own organizations. So I think that we can if we figure out ways to bridge that gap. And I think that there's also, there could be an increase in creativity in working with nonprofit organizations outside of the immigration world. I think that we all work very closely together. We work parallel with each other. And I imagine that there's other fields that have nonprofit services and agencies who are used to, or may have more experience dealing with huge increases in volunteer capacity and interest. Something that I think we've all mentioned, but maybe have not said explicitly, is that with this new administration and with the changes that happened this year, there's been such an increase in the American public knowing about this and being interested in it and wanting to do something about it, and it has been a very big challenge to deal with that. Whereas before we were knocking on doors, begging people to talk about this, begging people to listen. It's almost been surreal to hear people talking about Carnes and Dilley and know people in public in random situations who've heard about what you're talking about, when it feels like you've been screaming into the abyss for a while about this. So learning from other fields and areas of practice and nonprofit organizations there to see how they deal with some of the same challenges that we've been facing now.
And my thought is that in terms of housing, we absolutely have to reach out to new partners. I think that nonprofits can take the lead because we see what is happening on the ground. But in our particular case, we're working with a very handful of immigrant shelters in the country and emergency shelters in general. Other housing providers for the homeless is not an appropriate placement for someone who's an asylum seeker who's just come to the border. So we desperately have to have creative ideas of how to reach out to more kinds of partners who can provide this sort of housing and also sponsorship, accompaniment, and real care that people need. It's not just a bed and it's not just a week, it's, you know, extensive. So.
Okay, thank you. I think you've given us all a lot to think about. So there's a microphone at the back. If people want to start lining up for questions, we can shift into question and answer mode.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really informative. I come from San Diego, and we have a lot of border issues ourselves, but this was really informative. I do have a question for Andrea. With the surplus of funding that you're experiencing, has there been any discussion about, in tandem with building your own organizational capacity, maybe using some of those funds for other organizations to support their work?
I think that has been part of the discussion. I think that we're kind of regrouping quite a bit after this summer and the crises that our staff were dealing with and the increase in funding. And so one way that we're starting to do that, I mentioned we're partnering with the organization Kind and using some of those resources to build pro bono capacity, partnering with them. And so I think that is part of the discussion and part of the equation here.
I would also mention about Raíces that they have made it, opened it up to all of us as nonprofits to apply for bond funds to get clients out of detention. So there has been a lot of sharing of that funding.
Yes, all over the country.
Hi, thank you so much for this panel. It's been very informative as well, so I just wanted to echo that. We've seen a lot with this administration, a lot of changes to the asylum process. Sorry, I'm a little short. But with everything else that's going on, and the fact that we know immigrants are dealing with a lot more than the asylum process, right? The need for different social services, the trauma. How has other things in our political system, like the Brett Kavanaugh hearings and the situation with the survivors retelling their trauma, how do you think that's going to impact the way asylum judges now see asylum seekers who have some of these same issues, and that's why they're seeking asylum in the U.S.?
I know that it's had an impact on our volunteers. It's made them much more aware. That specific example has made many of our volunteers much more aware of the particular issues of people who have suffered a horrific trauma, trying to then tell their stories in an unfriendly, hostile environment, and the bias that exists against them.
Yeah, and I would add that actually it's also been that sort of theme of what we're seeing kind of under this administration and how women are treated and women's issues are being dealt with. We saw that firsthand with an Attorney General, former Jeff Sessions, Attorney General decision called Matter of AB. So the Board of Immigration Appeals issues precedential decisions that are binding on immigration judges. The Attorney General, by regulation, can also issue decisions, and he took it upon himself to issue a decision, Matter of AB, that overruled a decision from 2014, and that decision basically was allowed domestic violence victims in these countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and mostly the Northern Triangle countries to seek asylum based on that particular social group of domestic violence-based persecution, because they couldn't leave that relationship of their partner. And so Jeff Sessions decided to issue Matter of AB, and it said explicitly that it overruled that decision that previously gave a roadmap, a roadway to that type of relief. So judges had already been doing that a couple here and there of saying these are not viable claims, but now we've got a precedential decision with which we've got to contend on top of all the things that we're hearing about, like you said, the Kavanaugh hearings and kind of these attacks at women that a lot of us, I think, see.
Hi, my name is Emily Schwartz-Greco. I'm an editor with The Conversation, and we publish journalism that's written by scholars with an assist from veteran journalists. And I'm also a former immigration paralegal. That's what I was, and I was actually a Casa Marianela volunteer in the late 80s when I went to UT. And yet I have had trouble, even though I have a great interest in the issue, I've had a lot of trouble commissioning articles on these issues by scholars of philanthropy and nonprofits. And I just want to make sure people in the room know that they can find me and work with me if they'd like to publish some articles. And also I'd like to ask people on the panel if you know of any research done by academics about the work in this area, about those collaborations that maybe could be raised up now that readers would be more interested in. Thanks.
Great.
Could you repeat, I'm sorry, could you repeat the last part about, was it that you
So what the conversation can do, and often does, is when there's something that's newly newsworthy, we raise up research, because research takes a long time, and the news cycle will be gone, will probably have moved on by the time the research being done now is complete. But we are able to raise up research done previously, like even, between 1980 and 2017, we can publish articles raising up that research, explaining what researchers found, what they looked into, what the data said, what the findings were. We can do that now. It doesn't have to be new research because it's newly relevant. Is that clearer? Okay.
Thank you.
Yes, I would definitely love to get your card and talk with you afterwards about some of the things. Yes.
Yeah, and I would also encourage us as scholars to contribute to the conversation, to take our research and move it into the public realm through that venue. Next question.
I'm Barbara Ibrahim from Cairo, Egypt, where we deal with refugee issues on a huge scale. But I wanted to address this issue of housing and the non-legal needs of these families and the problem you have that your centers just don't have capacity for the numbers. I was at a conference recently where a Canadian consortia of community-based NGOs were talking about an amazing model that they have for increasing the number of refugees they can settle in their country by having communities make a commitment to all of the orientation and social needs of a family, and then finding a middle-class household that maybe is empty nester and has the young son's den, which could be turned into a small apartment. And they're finding ways to resettle thousands more refugees than they would have been able to otherwise, because communities are making commitments to take them shopping, get their kids in school, and find them this temporary housing. And so just thinking about ways that we can not only collaborate together, but also find the success models and build on them.
And that does seem to be an area where we can get practice and scholarship together in ways that would be very helpful, I think, in meeting some of the gaps that our panelists have identified. Did any of you want to respond?
In the conference that I just went to in Chicago, when the Canadians talk about privatization, that's what they're talking about, coming up with private solutions. And when we hear the word privatization, we cringe because it means private prisons. So quite a contrast between our two countries.
I also would just like to respond and thank you for giving that outside perspective. For those of you from the US, I just want to give you one example. You've been hearing about the caravan and the caravan and the caravan, and it's several thousand people. Meanwhile, in Costa Rica, a much smaller country, they have received 20,000 refugees from Nicaragua alone. Hasn't hit the press here. People aren't screaming to the high heavens or terrified. And so I think that we have a lot to learn from other countries and the ways that people are responding there in humane ways.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name is Jody Sanford, and I come from Minnesota. Thank you so much for your work. It's very inspiring to all of us. And so there's been a little conversation about ways that this community might be helpful to the kind of work that you're doing. There are some attorneys in the room, but there are others that touch graduate students and undergraduate students who work in social services, who try to think about infrastructures to support nonprofit community building and sharing information. And so when you think about ways that the resources that some of us might be able to touch could be of help to you, I'm just curious about what comes to mind.
I'm happy to start. I have one particular area that I think a lot of you would be really helpful in. And basically, there are a couple of models across the country, including in Baltimore. So I'm involved in the one in Baltimore, where that's my home base. And we have an immigration court in Baltimore. So we recently published, because with our training and litigation and support, we published a lot of practice advisories for attorneys on immigration law. And so we published a really comprehensive one on bond, which is basically bail. So bond for immigrants in detention, right? But there is such a thing as a detained docket for immigrants. So there's a non-detained docket and there's a detained docket. And I would urge all of you to consider where your closest immigration court is, and if you can partner with someone who's already observing the detained docket and taking notes on what's happening in the detained docket, how much bond is being set for, how long individuals are in detention, how long the continuances that the judges are granting, all of this data, and we have a model for it in Baltimore, but there are others too. If you want to take that and adapt it and really get your graduate students together, form a group, form a project that really just observes, takes the data, and then issues a report at the end of the day. We are finalizing our report for Baltimore right now with our data from over, I can't remember now, like a year and a half of the detained docket in Baltimore. And we started before the Trump inauguration because we wanted to see the differences before Trump came into office and after, and if the immigration judge on that detained docket had changed her bond amounts and the way that she was doing things. And obviously there have been some decisions that the Board of Immigration Appeals and former Jeff Sessions Attorney General had issued that have impacted as well. But this is an area that you do not have to be an attorney, that is really driven by data, by research, by statistics, by analysis. And I think all of you, based on what I know about you, would be really good at that and would find that interesting.
Yeah, others that want to?
I just want to add a little bit of detail about what we're talking about when we say the detained docket. I think Michelle's perfectly right. That's such a huge need, and it is something that's springing up around the country. But a lot of these hearings happen via video. So the person will be in a detention center and the judge will be elsewhere, and they're communicating with each other, often through an interpreter who your client, the respondent, the immigrant, is listening to over the phone, talking through the phone, and also a video of the judge. Some of these courts are literally closet type spaces in a detention facility with a small video screen. There's two now. I know one in Fort Worth, which is in North Texas, and another one I forget is in Virginia, the completely remote video teleconference courts. And so the detainee will be anywhere in the country. The attorney could appear in court in Fort Worth, and then the judge will be somewhere else too. So this is all happening via video. And when we're talking about due process and the fact that these are not Article III courts and they're under the executive branch and they're administrative courts, this is what this administration wants this to look like. They want it to be, Jennifer mentioned we were talking about this, kangaroo courts. They want to remove attorney participation and participation of the public, and they want you to not see what's happening here. So it would also be interesting to see what you guys could do in looking at the spread of these types of courts, what's happening in them, what barriers the detention facilities and the court administrators are putting up to you being able as the public to access these courts, because there are sections of those dockets that are meant to be open to the public. And that's unfortunately not the case, and there's not a lot of people complaining about that right now.
And unfortunately, case law has said that these types of teleconference, video conferencing type of hearings do comport with due process. But one thing is to say it, and it's another thing to follow it, and study it, and ensure that it does meet due process, especially as it changes and it increases.
Thank you.
I would also just,
oh, go ahead, Crystal.
just one real quick picture. So one family. There's one family that I know personally that was released and allowed to go live in my community. And the father of the family has type 1 diabetes. His insulin was taken away from him at the port of entry. By the time he was literally being driven from the ICE facility to the town where he was going to resettle, he had a major crisis and ended up being in the hospital for a week. And again, going back to what Jennifer's mentioned, you do not qualify for any type of support services. So when the hospital was trying to figure out how on earth this was going to be covered, there's no box to check. There's nothing that they qualify for. There's nobody in our community who was established to help put the 6 children all under the age of 12 into school or to help the parents through that process. There was nobody to help with eye care, with dental care, and everybody was horribly traumatized. They had had several family members murdered in front of them, including the children. And so we're asking these children to go to school, to be learning a new language, and we have no services, no psychological services, nothing available to them. So I just want to throw out that one little picture of one family and what they're trying to deal with within weeks of arriving, fleeing for their lives, with literally nothing but the clothes on their back and the insulin that was taken away from them. And let you think about ways and things that you might share with us about research you do or things that you think might be helpful, and I think we all welcome discussion afterwards as well.
Please.
Thank you again for all the presentations. It sounds like you all had to ramp up your levels of collaboration massively. If you could talk a bit about what made that work, and maybe if it didn't sometimes, what factors played in there.
As we were ramping our ways of coordination, what has worked, what hasn't worked.
Do we need clarity? Or?
No.
Who would like to respond?
I've taken the first stab at it every time. I'm going to defer.
Okay, I'll take a stab going back to Annunciation House in El Paso. So family separation, for whatever reasons, there are 3 detention centers around El Paso. One in El Paso, one an hour and a half outside, literally in the middle of nowhere, and then another that's technically in southern New Mexico, which leads to all kinds of special issues with the courts. A lot of the separated parents were sent there, and as families were being reunified after the administration being sued, many of them were going through the Annunciation House. And there has been this incredible response from attorneys around the country coming in to represent people who were detained. Our organization worked a lot on that end of trying to get the parents who were still stuck in there after supposedly all the parents had been reunited. And we still had dozens of cases of people that we were trying to get representation for so that they could get out and be reunited with their children. Meanwhile, we have another organization that is finding representation for people, but there's still people being separated. There's still people being released and reunited. The longer they've been apart, the more traumatized they are. And now they're moving on. And so there always seem to be holes and not ever quite enough, even as we're ramping things up and we're collaborating more and more and across more and more organizations. And I think I know for me, one of the hardest things is not to just be overwhelmed. It's that constant encouragement of, wow, we have so many organizations working together and everyone's passionate together in this fight. But then there's always that whole list of things we can't quite get to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think what hasn't worked, in my opinion, is that we still, we dealt with family detention, and now we have family separation, and now we're going to see what happens with this asylum proclamation. and the litigation that's moving forward as a result of that asylum proclamation. But we still don't have an infrastructure that's national that responds to these crises that are just going to continue. And it's, to me, it's a little bit mind-boggling that the country in the world that has the most money and the most resources hasn't gotten this together. And also going back to the concept of community and how other countries that may not be as rich as the United States are able to really get their communities involved in a more comprehensive way. You know, makes me wonder if it's because, you know, we have this individualistic nature as Americans, the pull yourself by your bootstraps theory is still out there. I'm not really sure what it is, but I think not having that infrastructure in place still is a problem, and we need to have it ready to go for the next caravan, for the next group of people that are going to invariably come. And then I think we do need to have Americans, and I think it's happening, I do, but I do think it would be great for Americans to go back to a time when, you know, during the New Deal, during the time when we all had to band together and really help one another, to have this mindset that it really is community that's going to get us through the next crisis.
I think that for those of you who were at the plenary yesterday, this is a wonderful kind of continuation, because a theme that was going on in that plenary was the need for resiliency, because there are ongoing natural disasters. And in this, what we've learned today, we can expect that there will be ongoing waves of immigrants seeking asylum. And so we see this call for collaboration, for expansion, and then concerns about the gaps. And so I want to thank our panelists. It was wonderful to hear the important work that they're doing on the ground and to share their experience with us. And thank you very much.